This video comes to you in cooperation with PCBWay, ICM and MRP Paints. Hello and welcome to the third episode of this build. We continue to make our way through the instruction booklet, going to the painting stage. Now let's assemble the tail rotor, which consists of 3 pieces and they're relatively cleanly molded. However, here on the leading and on the trailing edges of each blade there is something to be desired, so I will quickly go over them with some sandpaper and then we'll commence the assembly. The assembly of this part is rather simple, however I cannot seem to have a good fit here. The instructions do not mention removing this part, but I see no other choice. So maybe this was the issue. As you can see here, this area is a bit raised from this area. This area is raised too, and we have the same thing on the smaller part. So of course the lower area here needs to correspond to the higher area on the smaller part, and then they fit good. I think the pin was in the way for sure, but that's how it is supposed to be glued. And all it needs is just a small amount of cement. The cement SP that I use most of the time falls really nicely inside the joint and does a great job of gluing together the plastic parts. And the last piece of this puzzle is this part. I have no idea what this is called, but it should stay right here. And it fits very nicely, and just like that we have the tail rotor assembled. One last thing to mention: 2 of these legs are shorter than the other 2, which means that they should meet the correct pieces on the rotor, so you probably should rotate until you find the right spot. This O is not mentioned in the instructions and probably should be. The next step starts with a couple of holes that need to be drilled. It is this set here, not this one. Part E1 is supposed to be inserted right here, and without using glue, to attach the tail rotor so that it can spin when the aircraft is assembled. I think this is silly. I'm not attaching a tail rotor at this stage and I don't need it to be spinning when the model is finished. So this thing, this shaft of sorts, will go permanently in. The tail wheel will need to be installed before we assemble the 2 fuselage halves. Mine is not in the best shape possible. This part is very exposed and vulnerable to damage. Also, the mold step here is ridiculous. This is unacceptable, in my opinion. The tail wheel is made out of 2 identical pieces, D18, which are on the 2 small sprues, and there is no way to assemble them without a gap unless you clean up the ejector pins inside. Also, there is no sort of device that will help you to align them properly, so that's up to you. I will chisel out this because I don't want to disturb the shape of the wheel. And now for the assembly. I will be holding these together and to apply some cement SP. And while this is curing, I will do my best to align the two halves so that they are as much as possible in register. It wouldn't have hurt at all if we had some device to help us. The other half of the gear of the tail wheel assembly also has a ejector pin mark, which for sure will make the assembly not good, so it needs to go. After the glue is done drying, the wheel needs to be sanded down on its contact surface. Next up, we get into a dilemma, which shouldn't been there in the first place. Now we have a choice. Do we assemble the gear leg and the wheel and struggle with the wheel painting, or we get the parts painted separately and then deal with the consequences? So I guess it is a matter of picking your own poison. And that's not an approach that I am very happy with, to be fair. Maybe ICM decided that since the wheel and the leg are black, then we don't need anything else to do. But what if I wanted to paint that wheel in rubber black, the rubber portion? Just like that, the tail wheel is assembled, and I will have to figure out some way to mask and paint the rubber. This video is sponsored by PCBWay, which are celebrating their 11th anniversary. Right now, through July 18th, they are offering big discounts on PCB fabrication, 3D printing and CNC machining, plus coupon deals, a lucky draw with awesome gifts and more. The first 5 of you who use the coupon code in the description will get $10 off for purchases above $30. If you are curious about ordering 3D prints from PCBWay, it's super easy. Check the link in the description to grab your discount and join the celebration. Now let's install the masks. The exterior set is quite straightforward because there is no actual curvature to take into account. Hopefully the manufacturer have already taken it into account when creating the stencils. Now, using thin side with no center section makes it slightly more difficult to start the mask, but then it will conform better to the surface because there is no middle section to get in the way. And as you can see, it takes less than a minute to complete one of the masks. Another benefit of having these thin outlines is that if something is wrong or not exact, we can always do some changes that will reduce the defect. Now, with the internal masking, things are not so straightforward because here we have the thickness of the actual plastic plus the radius of the curvature that the detail makes, and then you have a complex part that has decreasing radiuses and all kind of things that make it very difficult to calculate how much and where to reduce the size of the mask. So I just cut the masks the same as the one for the outside, and what I'm going to do is to adapt them right here in place, in situ as some might say. And here comes the beauty of having just more or less strips of tape for masks. The adaptation is quite easy. Just a few cuts and we are ready to rock. And here we have both sides masked. Now someone may ask, what about the empty space? Well, it's very easy with some liquid mask, a silicone brush. Now I have heard that there are some clear plastics that do not react very well with liquid masks. I personally haven't had one of those so far, but it may be a good idea to check on the sprue or somewhere more inconspicuous before you attack your important details. I don't know how accurate one can be cutting by hand, but using the X-Tool 1M is a real treat. Things happen quick, easy, and it is fast. If you make mistake, you can quickly change the design and go back with new sets of masks. Super handy tool to have. Now for the trickier bits, the shape is complex in all dimensions, so it takes some experience and also a lot of patience. But as you probably very well know, patience is something that is very helpful when it comes to building scale models. Well, it was not bad at all in terms of difficulty. I bet you can hear me focusing. And there we have it. If you are curious what kind of tape I'm using, it is this brand, made in Italy, and I found it in the hardware store. It's very similar to Tamiya masking tape, but it's much cheaper and much larger, and I think it works very well. The internal bits are slightly more involved in their installation, but once you put the mask in place, I always start with a straight section, or at least as straight as it is possible. Then it quickly becomes obvious where the cuts should be made in order to account for the curvatures and the general shape and the dimension difference between the exterior and interior parts of the transparent item. As you can see here, we need some, not much, but some overlapping. To get the latest updates, join me on Patreon. Link I will leave in the description. And that's done. Removing these parts right now is not really per the instructions, but I want to prep them and paint them with the rest of the interior. Some ejector pins for removal, as usual. Not especially difficult, just time consuming and frankly annoying. On the pilot doors we have no ejector pins, but I will have the pleasure to deal with some flash here and there, especially on the window frame, and this flash will be an obstruction if I don't take care of it. One last thing before we can start painting is to fix the tail wheel, because of course it broke. Now I broke it trying to see whether or not this thing will fit in place, i.e. making a dry fit test. I don't know if this is by design or it is poorly designed. However, this thing cannot be inserted inside the opening. Same goes for this part. Maybe the openings are not made for full embedding, but one would think that this kind of assembly is exactly with this meaning. So we have two options here. One is just to glue this in place and hope it doesn't break again, or I can drill some holes at some thicker wire and then glue it in place. so maybe I'll do the second one. In order to preserve the joint detail, I have a maximum budget of 0.5 mm for the drill bit, but this will be enough and will allow me to use cable tie wire, just like this one, and that will save the day. Some super glue, a straight section of the wire, and we are cooking. Further dry fit tests revealed that one side of the connection is larger than the other, which is not much of a deal, but here the size of the hole is not even close to fitting, and I don't see a way in which I can sandwich this between the fuselage halves. So I'm going to take a chance and drill out this hole to be wider and the other one too, so that we can at least mount the gear leg for the assembly stage. Well, with all done, I think it is time to put the mask on, load the airbrush with some good finishing surfacer and apply the primer. It is always a good idea to burnish the tape on more demanding surfaces just before you apply the paint on. I would like to thank all the amazing people who support me on Patreon. You guys are awesome. Alright, we are mostly done with the primer application, but before we finish it, I would like to mount the windows in the doors. I am cutting them not directly next to the part, but rather more inside to the sprue. The fit here is very good, however the orientation matters. As you can see here on the inside we have excellent fit, on the outside as well. But if I flip around the window, we still have good fit on the inside. However, on the outside we get a gap on the bottom. That's why the orientation matters. Now I'm going to use Mr. Cement SP in a very small quantity to fix the window in place. When using such plastic cement on parts where mask is applied, make sure that this glue does not pull on the mask or right next to it, because it will go underneath and will ruin your work. So apply the glue very sparingly. Now if you cut the sprue connection on a transparent part, very close to the transparent part, it is very likely that the sprue connection will break a indentation in the part, which is why I cut it somewhere near and then do the rest with a knife, and finally with some sandpaper to remove any trace of the sprue connection. This clear plastic is very brittle, so it needs to be handled carefully. Finally, I will apply some black primer to hide this. And with that, it is time to mount it in its position. Here, there is no way to make a mistake with the orientation. The windows are side specific and they go in only one way. As usual, a very small amount of glue, it will flow. This is the thinnest glue in the range, in the Mr. Cement range, so it does a great job of flowing inside the joint. It melts the two parts together and then we have a strong bond. Painting the entirety of the fuselage inside in the black primer may look like an overkill, but there are a few advantages that this approach gives us. One of them is that if there is any see-through, some hole that is not closable, we have black interior and nothing will be seen, no bare plastic. The other one is that now I can sand all the join lines, their faces, and make sure that it is all nice and even. As you can see here, for instance, we have a lower portion of this joint face, and now with the sanding stick I'm going to make it flat. Alright fellas, this is going to be it for today's episode. I hope you liked it and find it useful. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, happy modeling!